If you want to skip straight to the topic, go to 5 minutes 35. But if you do, you're going to miss the best footage I've ever taken. And it's not the rainbow. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that rain is not something we want when we go out riding. But sometimes you get stuck in it, don't you? And on this day, I got drenched, guys. I was doing Uber Eats, and I was too far away from anything to stop and take cover. So I just had to keep riding through it. And my shoes aren't waterproof, so they got absolutely soaked. My socks were just totally waterlogged. And I had to ride like 20 kilometers. So that's about as bad as it gets, isn't it, for us? And, you know, no one wants to get wet shoes no matter where you are. It's the worst, isn't it? Wet socks. Imagine going swimming with your shoes on. That's basically what it feels like. And of course, there's the debate on whether it's bad for the wheel. I think this Sherman, I was on the Max this time, but I think the Sherman design in general, because the OG is pretty much the same, is but waterproof enough so that any kind of rain is never going to affect it, even heavy rain. I reckon you need to submerge it to actually get water into the mainboard. Just because of the way the panels overlap each other, so water can't actually get up into it. It would have to like climb up, so you need some pressure to lift the water up through the grooves. But as bad as it was getting on this day, there was some light at the end of the tunnel. Look at that. Beautiful, huh? Of course, when you get rain and sunshine at the same time, you get a rainbow. Oh yeah, and by the way, we're going to talk about that electricity thing again. The voltage versus range discussion that I talked about in the last video. I had lots of comments about that, and yeah, there was some things I missed out, and I want to re-emphasize some other things too. Something pretty important, actually. But where I am now, I was delivering this Uber order. I got an Uber order super early in the morning, probably about 6 a.m. And it took me out to the mountains on the Sherman. And I noticed this, like the clouds going over the mountains. That looks cool, doesn't it, guys? And luckily I had my drone. So I thought I want to send this baby out there. Let's have a look. What's this all about? And here we are, guys. Here we are up in the sky, reporting. It's a good thing I got this thing, isn't it? Just fits in your pocket. Anytime, anywhere. Make some B-roll, make some bankroll, baby. Yeah, this was the best purchase I reckon I've ever made. For the money, for what it does, it's just the best. You might be thinking, no, the EUC isn't it? But this was cheaper. So, considering what it costs, this thing is amazing. It's basically an EUC, the way it balances in the sky. It's basically 3 EUCs. It's balancing 3 axes at once. But I was actually lying, guys. I didn't have my drone in my pocket. I had to go all the way home to get it. Because when I came out to these mountains, I saw this sky and I was like, dude, I wish I had my drone with me. I just didn't bring it. I left it all the way back at home. So I went all the way back home from the mountains to get this drone, because I've never seen this in person. Like, I've seen drone footage of it on the internet and stuff, but in person it's rare to see that, you know, because I don't live in that kind of area. And so I thought I got to get my drone. So I went back on the Sherman all the way back home, and when I got back I still had full battery. Can you believe it? On the Sherman Max. Pretty crazy. All the way to the mountains and back, still full bars, hadn't dropped a single bar. And makes you think, just how much do you really need 4800 watt hours, like on the Master Pro. The Max has 3600 watt hours, so imagine adding another 1200 to that. So then you can go to the mountains and back, and then back to the mountains and then back again, all in one day, and still have full battery. Still haven't dropped a single bar. Do you really need that much range? You're better off burning through a bit of the battery, really, to be honest. You don't want to always be so close to full charge, because it's not best for the longevity of the battery. It's better to actually hang around the mid-range So depending on how you're riding, you might be better off getting a smaller battery and make sure you get down to the 40-30% sometimes at least. And on your average, let's say you get it down to 50-60%, that would be ideal, I reckon, for battery longevity. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty much the end of this video. I haven't really planned a topic as such. I just wanted to talk about the... Oh no, what am I saying? So we're going to talk about a few more things regarding that voltage versus range discussion in the last video. The question is, do you want more volts or less volts to maximize range? Because when you make an EUC, let's say you choose how many batteries you're going to put in it, how many cells. For example, the OG Sherman has 240 cells or 240 batteries inside, and you've got a choice. The way they arranged it, they made it 100 volts and 32 amp hours. But you could have made it different. You could have actually made it 1000 volts and 3.2 amp hours if you just put them all in series. Do you see? It depends how you put the battery together, how many volts you're going to have in the end. And so again, the question is, how many volts do you want to maximize your range? Do you want more volts or less volts? And my video said more volts is better because it's more efficient. Because if you have more volts, you don't need as many amps. Therefore, you've got less heat being produced in the wires and less losses. And you could have thinner wires too. And someone mentioned that if you have thinner wires, you're going to have more resistance, so it's going to be the same. But what I said was you can have a middle ground, so then you could have slightly thinner wires and still have less losses. Do you see what I mean? Or just use thicker wires. Doesn't really matter. But the question again is, how many volts do you want to get the most range? In my last video, I didn't really give a good answer in terms of, I said more volts is better, right? Because you've got less amps. But that doesn't really mean anything. That's too open-ended. That would mean that you want the most volts possible. So the Sherman should have been a 1000 volt wheel. They should have put them all in series, just made it 1000 volts, and then you'd have had the most range. But obviously that's not the right answer, is it? I don't know, but I doubt it. Just intuitively, I doubt that would be the way to go. So obviously there's an ideal voltage, isn't there? At some voltage, you have an ideal situation where you have the most range possible. But again, it gets more complex than that because it depends what kind of range test you're talking about. If you're doing a high speed range test, it would probably have a different ideal voltage than a low speed range test. I'm guessing that a low speed range test would benefit from a higher voltage because in the last video, the idea was that higher volts gives you less amps. It means you can run the same amount of power with less amps. So you've got less heat being produced in the wires, less heat losses, therefore less energy losses. Therefore you got maximum range because you're using the most energy for movement, not to produce heat in the wires. But the caveat with that is that more voltage gives you access to more power because power equals volts times amps. So if you've got higher volts, you can generate more power, again with less heat, which is a good thing. But if you're generating more power, you're sucking more energy from the batteries. Therefore, you're going to get less range if you push it hard, which you can. Therefore, most people will. And I said that in the last video, most people won't actually get more range. They're going to push it hard. They're going to suck their battery dry faster than they normally would. Perhaps some people won't. But if you ride slowly, that's when you'll be able to get the most range out of your high voltage wheel. And in theory, really, if it's well designed, you should be able to match the low voltage wheel's range if you just ride the way you used to ride. Do you know what I mean? Don't push it so hard. The thing is though, higher voltage wheels will have higher top speeds in general. So if you can ride faster, you can really suck that energy out. One thing people don't understand about speed is that, what do you think it is? Like, if I double my speed, how much more power do I need to sustain that speed? Most people would say 4 times, wouldn't they? Because wind resistance is proportional to the square of velocity, isn't it? So you double it, then you got 4 times more force, 4 times more wind resistance, right? But power equals force times velocity. That's the mechanical way of looking at it. There's the electrical way as well, volts times amps. But in terms of moving a mechanical system, a physical, real-world motion, whether it be rotational or linear, when it's rotational, it's torque times angular velocity, which is measured in radians per second, which can be converted into RPM, or revolutions per minute. So what I'm saying is that's the physical way of looking at power. It's force times velocity. And in ideal conditions, by the way, in theory, your volts times your amps should match your force times your velocity, because they're both measures of power, right? So if you're using, let's say, 100 volts at 30 amps, you're using 3,000 watts of power electrically, but you're converting that into mechanical power, aren't you? Through rotation initially, so it'd be torque times angular velocity. And those should match up, but of course you've got losses, don't you? You lose energy through heat, like we spoke about, and friction. You've got basic friction through the bearings and stuff, not much. And you've got road friction, and of course you've got wind resistance, but that's what we're talking about pushing against. Oh, no, actually, yeah, you could add the road friction to that too. But anyway, so if you double your velocity, you've doubled the force, right? Sorry, you've quadrupled the force due to the wind resistance, but you've also doubled the velocity. Therefore, the power goes up 8-fold. 8 times, can you believe it? So you double your velocity, you need 8 times more horsepower. 8 times more watts. It's an incredible amount. So if you've got a higher voltage wheel and it's letting you go faster, even just by a little bit, you're going to use a boatload more power than you normally would. Just to go from, let's say, 70 kilometers an hour to 80, or 80 to 90, 90 to 100. You're going to burn that battery up so fast, you won't even believe it. You'll be thinking, did they give me a freaking hoverboard battery? A one-wheel battery? So there you go. Keep that in mind. 8 times. And it also relates to cutouts too. Because, of course, the faster you go, the more power you need. And you've got a power limit. That's what determines the cutout. At some point, your EUC just can't handle the power you're demanding, and it cuts out, whether it's the motor or the battery or the controller or the wires. Something in that link where the power flows through is failing. It's breaking the link. You lose power, you lose balance. You cut out, you fall down. So keep in mind that when you go faster, you need 8 times more power just to go twice as fast. So even if you're just going a little bit faster, let's say from 60 kilometers an hour up to 70, you're using a whole lot more power. Not 8 times, because you're not doubling it. I'll put it up on the screen, I don't know, but it's more than you'd think because of that relationship between power and velocity. Just to keep it in mind, because I see a lot of people really pushing their wheels, just thinking, oh, I just go a bit faster, it'll be all good, even though they're already beeping and they've already pushed well beyond that speed, and they just keep on accelerating, thinking, it's going to be all good, but really, they're so close to the limit. I mean, I can't be sure, but I just know that the faster you go, you're using just so much more power. And power relates to energy, of course. Power equals the rate of flow of energy, or the rate of consumption of energy. So 1 watt, for example. Oh, and just because I didn't mention it before, 1 horsepower equals 746 watts. Or in other words, 1 kilowatt is about 1.4 horsepower. So a kilowatt is bigger than the horsepower. But what a watt is, 1 watt is 1 joule per second. And 1 joule is a measure of energy. It's what it takes to heat up, like, I think it's 1 cubic centimeter of water, so 1 gram of water, by 1 degrees Celsius, or 1 Kelvin, which is the same thing. That's what 1 joule is. And it's a measure of energy, but it's the same way you measure your food's energy. So like, an apple has a certain number of joules. They measure in kilojoules. Or calories, that's just another conversion. So that's what all power is how fast are you using up your energy. And putting it to use too, I would say, because you could use it all and just lose it all as heat. So you just got a bunch of heat loss. And you could call that power, but if you're trying to move a wheel, you're trying to drive a vehicle, I would say that's just losses. Oh, and by the way, 1 watt hour equals 3.6 kilojoules. So when you look at your food ingredients, on the back of your package or whatever, it would say how many kilojoules are in a serving of what you're eating. Well, you can convert that directly into watt hours. And something interesting about that is that you'll find it's actually more efficient to write an EUC than it is to eat food and cycle. Crazy, isn't it? And it's especially true considering what you're eating. If you're eating anything that's processed, then the amount of energy that's gone into making that food is far more than what appears at its surface, isn't it? Because, you could count the energy that's in the food itself, but how much energy has gone into actually making that food, into producing it, into growing the plants and feeding the animals. So if you're eating animals, it's 10 times worse again, because animals eat plants, don't they? So you're eating an animal that was eating plants for how many years before it got slaughtered to finally be food after all these years of eating plants, drinking water, taking medicine, being sheltered, cared for, everything getting shipped around. So even once that food is ready, it gets shipped all over the place. So it's so much more efficient just to write an EUC than it is to eat a freaking hamburger, let's say, and ride your bike. Hamburgers is probably the worst thing. But even something like an apple, it still works out. No, actually, I'm probably wrong on that, because trees, if you're just eating apple, trees just grow by themselves, don't they? Trees can grow without any care or maintenance whatsoever. And they last 100 years or even more, producing fruit every year for free. So yeah, in that case, it's cheaper to just eat that and ride a bike. But then there's the maintenance on the bike, isn't there? A bicycle takes a lot more maintenance than an EUC. So once you work that out, then maybe we're still on top, guys. We're more green than the cyclist who eats nothing but apples and bananas from trees in the jungle. No one really knows where he services his bike, though. So it still doesn't really make sense, but I would say we're on top. I just wanted to add something. I did put it in text throughout the video, but I just forgot to mention it while I was talking. And it's that, as stated, there's an ideal voltage where you're going to get max range. We don't know what that is, but the real question is, are we there yet? For example, we're at around 100 volts now, aren't we? We're at between 100 and 130 volts, roughly. Is that at ideal territory yet? And the reason I say there must be an ideal voltage is because, think about it. When you make a Sherman OG, for example, it's got 240 cells. You could put them all in series and get a 1,000 volt wheel. But do you think that's going to give you the most range? I highly doubt it. I highly doubt you're going to make any type of system. And I know it depends on what kind of motor you're going to use and everything. If you've got a 1,000 volt wheel, you're going to have different windings, bigger motors, bigger magnets and all that. But assuming you can optimize it for that voltage, get the most range possible, do you think a 1,000 volt Sherman is going to give you the most range? I doubt it. So then the question is, what is going to give you more range? Well, obviously less than 1,000 volts. Currently we're at 100. And I don't think that's going to give you the most range either. I think it's going to be something in between. And for those that are wondering, wait, 1,000 volts, how can you have a 1,000 volt Sherman? The Sherman OG has 240 lithium cells in it, each are 4.2 volts. If you put them all in series, you could make a 1P battery, right? It'd be a 240S 1P battery. And it would be about 1,000 volts when it's fully charged. If you've got the Sherman Max, it's going to be even higher. It could be 1,100 volts. So that's it. You could have a 1,000 volt wheel, but is that going to max your range out? I doubt it. Is 100 volts going to max your range out? I don't know, but I don't think so. Some people are saying that lower is better, so we should go back to like 60 volts if we want the most range. But I don't think that's the case, guys. We're going to have to wait and see, though. We're going to have to see the new wheels coming out with high voltages and see what kind of ranges we can get when we do a long range test, like a low speed test. you know? That's my theory. My prediction is that if you do a low speed test, then a higher voltage wheel will give you more range. To a point, like I said, you don't want to go up to 1,000 volts, but I think 150, maybe even 200 volts would be good. I think 220, 240 volts would be excellent, because that's what we get supplied here in Australia, at least. In the mains power outlets, they're all 240 volts. So I think it would be good to have a wheel that's matching that voltage. It would probably allow you to have smaller charges and whatnot. Perhaps. I don't know to be sure, but I think there'd be benefits to that. Anyway, we'll end it now.